Dear friends, welcome to my channel. US President Donald Trump has issued a final ultimatum to the Iranian leadership and has refused Putin's services as a mediator. This is already the second slap in the face to the Kremlin dictator. Let me remind you, just the day before, Israel also refused Putin's mediation. Tension is rising among Donald Trump supporters in the United States. The MAGA supporters have quarreled with the traditionalist Republicans, and Trump's propagandists are calling each other liars, scoundrels, and other such names. In particular, there was a falling out between TV hosts Levin and Carlson. Trump calls the latter crazy. And not so long ago, he was one of the most loyal supporters of the Republican president. CNN reported on what awaits Trump if, in the event of entering the war on Israel's side, he fails to destroy Iran's nuclear program. All of America's worst fears would come true. The NATO summit will be held on a shortened schedule. Everything is supposed to be finished in just 2.5 hours, all because Trump gets tired of long meetings, and the communique will be only 5 paragraphs long. The war party in the Kremlin considers Putin too soft and is demanding that he declare war in Ukraine and begin a general mobilization. However, there are those who oppose this. The IAEA has not found evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, but it cannot account for 409 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, which is enough to produce 10 bombs. And finally, one more sensation. Keith Kellogg, President Trump's special representative for Ukraine, is heading to Belarus on a mediation mission. All this and more coming up. So Trump has issued the very last final ultimatum to Tehran, stating that he demands only one thing from them: conditional surrender. It's simple. Trump writes on his social network, Truth Social, Tehran must surrender. He also stated that if the official leadership in Tehran does not accept the terms of the ultimatum, then the American military will strike Iran's nuclear and military facilities from the air. Then we'll blow up all their nuclear stuff. They're all over the place there, President Trump declared. At the same time, he reminded that for 40 years, the leadership in Tehran has always said death to America, death to Israel, death to everyone they don't like. Along the way, Trump also sent Vladimir Putin to a well-known address quite unexpectedly during a phone conversation that took place on Donald Trump's 79th birthday. Let me remind you, they spoke, Putin called him, and they talked for about an hour, and Trump enthusiastically declared that supposedly his friend Vladimir is now ready to act as a mediator between Jerusalem and Tehran, and promised him to resume negotiations with Ukraine. And now, as we say, the love is gone and the tomatoes have withered. Vladimir Putin is no longer dear to Donald Trump's heart. He addressed Putin through the media and said, I tell him, do me a favor, be a mediator in your own country. Vladimir, let's deal with Russia first, and you can take care of that later. He clarified that he was referring to Ukraine, the resolution of which Trump has consistently advocated since his presidential campaign. In addition, he once again reminded that a lot of very bad things could still happen in the East. Nothing is over until it's over. War is a very complicated and difficult thing. At the same time, Trump declares that he is not going to make any compromises with the leadership in Tehran, demands unconditional surrender, and insists that this must happen within the next few days. If this does not happen, if the United States does not receive signals that Iran is ready to surrender, then a military attack by the US will lead to serious and irreparable consequences, Trump stated. Iran must understand that it needs to make a decision in the near future. It is better to negotiate with America, or otherwise Iran will have to face the full force, the military might of America, which is already moving its 2 key aircraft carrier groups there. In addition, as reported by ABC News, the United States may decide to enter the war on Israel's side within the next 48 hours. Sources from the Jerusalem Post have reported that if the United States enters the war on Israel's side, the first target of an attack by the US Air Force will be the uranium enrichment plant in Fordo. The one that the Israeli Air Force is unable to destroy is located there at a depth of over 60 meters, this nuclear facility. Meanwhile, whether Donald Trump can make the corresponding decision or not, the New York Post, a publication close to the Republicans, not to be confused with the New York Times, as it is less well-known, internationally supports Republicans and Trump in particular. The New York Post conducted its own poll, which found that the majority of Republicans who support Trump are in favor of launching military action against Iran. In particular, among the staunch MAGA supporters, the most conservative segment of Trump's base, 65% support strikes on Iran, while 19% are opposed. Among traditionalist Republicans, 51% support a strike on Iran. So essentially, this is already a green flag for Trump, meaning he has full support among his base, both MAGA supporters and traditionalists. And this is a clear indication Trump is always very sensitive to such polls. A clear indication of how Trump will start to act. And as another American TV channel, CBS News, warns about this, Trump's decision could be made in the very near future. For now, his advisors are divided. Some MAGA supporters and isolationists have clashed with other Trump supporters who advocate for entering the war on Israel's side. And Trump's decision could also be influenced by the following information, as reported by the British publication The Telegraph. In particular, it reports that at least 3 Boeing 747 cargo planes have departed from China since June 14. Their listed destination was Luxembourg. However, none of the 3 planes traveling from China to Luxembourg actually made it there. Instead, they all landed in Iran. The last plane to land was a flight from Shanghai, which touched down on Iranian territory. According to the Telegraph, these planes may be used to transport weapons needed by Iran in its war with Israel. In particular, these could be air defense systems, and the planes may also be used to carry out other important cargo. Exactly what kind of cargo is not specified. It could be money, gold, or other items that are considered valuable to the Tehran regime. But in any case, Iran saw, to be more precise, China's indirect involvement in this ongoing war by supporting Tehran's actions could essentially act as a provocation, much like waving a red rag to a bull for Donald Trump, provoking a strong and potentially unpredictable response. It could be that very last straw that breaks the camel's back, as we remember from the well-known English proverb. And then there are the scandals among MAGA supporters and traditionalist Republicans in particular. The prospect of the US entering the war on Israel's side against Iran has split Donald Trump's camp of supporters. The isolationists want Trump to absolutely stay out of this military conflict. This group includes, in particular, the notorious former TV host and now podcaster Tucker Carlson, Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon, and the controversial Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. For example, Carlson appeared on Bannon's podcast. Bannon is also a podcaster and stated that Trump should abandon Israel. And Taylor Greene said that those who want to start a war with Iran are not supporters of magic. That's how it is. That is, they are already starting to measure who of them is more of a supporter of the magician and who is less. At the same time, those advocating for tough measures against Iran, claiming that now is the most favorable moment for an attack, include Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, as well as TV hosts Mark Levin and Sean Hannity. And they've already managed to quarrel among themselves. In particular, Levin called Carlson a lying propagandist, and Carlson in turn accused him of wanting to drag America into World War III. As for Trump himself, he no longer holds back and has called Tucker Carlson crazy. As you may recall, I've talked about this as well. The reasons why Israel decided that the present moment is the most favorable are primarily due to the fall of the dictatorial regime in Syria. After Bashar al-Assad lost the civil war to his opponents and fled to Russia by plane, the fate of Tehran was essentially sealed. It was only a matter of time how long it would take Israel to prepare for an attack. In other words, with one adversary out of the game, Israel is analyzing the situation and understands that sooner or later power in Damascus will be consolidated again. Syria is a country that for decades has been an enemy of Israel and, of course, wanted its complete destruction, just like the regime in Tehran. And that is why the situation must be taken advantage of. While Syria is out of the picture and still not back on its feet, Tehran is essentially left alone here among Israel's most sworn enemies. That's why it needs to be dealt with here and now. That's why the fall, I'll repeat once again, of Bashar al-Assad's regime became a green light for Israel to prepare an attack on Iran. At the same time, Trump himself and the American military are impressed by how successfully Israel's air assault is developing. However, there is now a serious problem. Iran has started to mainly use old model ballistic missiles. They are overloading the Israeli air defense system so that it uses up its missiles, counting on the fact that these missiles will eventually run out. And according to a number of reports, including those from several Telegram channels close to intelligence services, particularly in Turkey and the United States, indeed Israel's air defense missiles are not completely depleted. But in any case, their stockpiles have been significantly reduced. When more serious missiles are launched from Iranian territory specifically, new generation two-stage solid fuel ballistic missiles, this could pose an even greater threat. We are already seeing the number of dead and wounded reaching into the hundreds. Dozens of residential buildings have already been destroyed, and the Israeli air defense system, the Iron Dome, is currently letting through 10 to 15% of ballistic missiles, according to official statistics. How many in reality we do not know, and that is why in any case the situation is tending to get worse. And that is why the key question for Israel right now is to draw in, to force the United States to enter this war on their side, primarily in order to destroy Iran's key nuclear facility, for though it is impossible to destroy it without American missiles, more precisely. Bunker buster GBU bombs, which by the way are in service with the US Air Force. And finally, CNN, analyzing everything that is happening, says that entering the war against Israel, combined with the failure to destroy Iran's nuclear program, if these objectives are not achieved, could become the worst nightmare and have the gravest consequences for America. In other words, if the US joins the Israeli operation, CNN reports, and fails to destroy the Fordo facility with the GBU-57 bunker buster bomb, it would mean that Iran's nuclear program has survived completely intact. And then after the war ends, the leadership in Tehran will fully commit itself to developing nuclear weapons in order to ensure its own survival. This is how CNN reports on the matter. And once again, I'll repeat, there are certainly serious risks involved, especially since the IAEA states that there is no evidence Iran is attempting to produce nuclear weapons. This was stated by IAEA Director Rafael Grossi. Tulsi Gabbard, the head of US National Intelligence, has also previously made this statement. As Grossi stated at the press conference, no other country in the world enriches uranium to 60% as Iran does. And from a technical standpoint, this is almost equivalent to the 90% level required to create nuclear weapons. At the same time, while not seeing any signs of preparations to create nuclear weapons, the IAEA stated that it cannot determine the whereabouts of 409 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, which theoretically should be located at the underground facility in Isfahan. And now, the authorities in Tehran have stated that they simply hid it. Tehran announced that the stocks of highly enriched uranium would be relocated for security reasons. So far, there is no evidence or proof that Tehran has, let's say, come close to creating an atomic bomb. The information that has been officially disseminated by the Israeli government has not yet been confirmed by American intelligence. We see that the IAEA refutes all of this. But that does not mean that in reality, the authorities in Tehran have not been developing this very weapon. In other words, everything could actually be happening in such a way that it really does exist. But this can only be proven by destroying the Fordo nuclear facility. Again, this is impossible without the involvement of the Americans. Meanwhile, Donald Trump will take part in the Alliance Summit in The Hague next week. Let me remind you, it will be held on June 24th and 25th. Zelensky has also been invited there. And for now, as of this moment, it is expected that Zelensky will indeed meet with Trump at a joint lunch meeting. The summit itself, which usually consisted of 3 sessions of 2.5 hours each, will be reduced to a single session lasting 2.5 hours. All of this is being done to avoid tiring Trump and to prevent him from expressing anger and criticism toward the ally. Additionally, the summit communique, which is primarily focused on increasing countries' military spending, will fit into 5 paragraphs on a single A4 sheet. In contrast, the NATO summit in Washington in 2024 concluded with a declaration consisting of 44 points. Just compare that totaled 500 words. In other words, everything is being shortened for Trump. The meeting has been cut to a third of its usual length, and the communique has been reduced to a single page. It's unclear whether the meeting will ultimately take place in The Hague. Let me remind you, that's in the Netherlands, the meeting between Zelensky and Trump. Everyone is afraid of an outburst of negative emotions and posts on Truth Social. To prevent this from happening, diplomats will try, so to speak, to put Trump in a positive mood. They will do everything they can to keep him in good spirits. Finally, the Telegraph reports another interesting piece of information that tensions are now rising not just among Trump's supporters, as we discussed earlier, but now among Putin's supporters as well, with growing friction between the hawks and the doves. The hawks in the Kremlin are demanding that Putin give a tough response to Operation Web against Russian strategic aviation. Specifically, according to the publication sources, the war party has demanded that Putin officially declare war on Ukraine. This is not the first time. We understand that none of this will happen. They are also calling for a general mobilization that would involve 2 million Russian reservists. There are also calls to use tactical nuclear weapons and to begin daily strikes on Ukrainian territory with intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The most radical representatives, among whom are figures like Dimon Medvedev, the well-known alco blogger, and Russian military officials, though the Telegraph does not name them, so we can only guess who they are referring to, are demanding decisiveness from Putin. At the same time, as the Telegraph writes, they believe that Putin is not acting decisively enough. Putin himself has not publicly commented on Operation Web or its consequences. However, everything seems to be leaning toward a more conservative scenario. Most likely, Putin will not announce any mobilization, writes the Telegraph, since it would undermine economic stability, and Putin himself is afraid of provoking serious discontent. We remember that when they discussed this before, they conducted numerous surveys with VT Zayom handling them, and they found out, in particular, that the majority of Russians have an extremely negative perception of any idea of mobilization. For now, they are trying to cover all of these with contracts. In particular, the Institute for International Security Problems writes that the influx into the army increased by 22% from January to May compared to last year. And Dmitry Medvedev estimated the reinforcements from January to May at 175,000 volunteers or contract soldiers, meaning 175,000 on average. That's 30 to 40,000 people joining each month. Those are the figures cited by Dmitry Medvedev. Finally, Keith Kellogg, Trump's special representative on Ukraine, will travel to Belarus in the coming days to meet with the potato Führer Alexander Lukashenko. This is reported by the well-informed Reuters. It's clear that the information is reliable. The exact agenda of Kellogg's meeting with Lukashenko has not been disclosed. However, the key underlying motive is most likely to get Lukashenko to push Putin toward new peace negotiations. Reuters also reminds us that the last high-ranking American diplomat to visit Belarus was Mike Pompeo, who was then Secretary of State. In 2020, he came to Belarus with the aim of establishing relations with the dictator Lukashenko at a time when relations between Belarus and Russia were at their lowest point. At that time, the US State Department did not officially comment on this information. Special Representative Keith Kellogg himself also ignored journalists' requests. However, the likelihood of this meeting taking place is extremely, extremely high. It is not known, however, whether the possibility of holding negotiations on the territory of Belarus will be discussed. In fact, the Belarusian opposition in particular Latushko, has already warned that it would be a huge mistake to hold these negotiations on the territory of Belarus, since Belarus itself is an accomplice in the aggression against Ukraine, has provided its territory, and a number of Belarusian citizens have participated in the invasion of Ukraine. It has been reported that at least several hundred of them have been contracted into the Russian armed forces and are fighting on the side of the occupiers against the Ukrainian army. In short, this meeting will probably still take place. Will it lead to any proper results? Most likely no. Appointing Minsk as the location for these negotiations here, there will definitely be a veto from Ukraine, which will not allow this to happen. But perhaps the Americans also want to sound out Lukashenko's intentions regarding the Zapad 2025 exercises. Let me remind you, these are the largest exercises announced in recent years, which are causing great concern for the Baltic countries and Poland. I think that in general, it will all end up leading nowhere. The consultations will take place. Lukashenko and his propaganda will loudly proclaim that he has already come out of isolation, but most likely there will be no concrete consequences from this meeting. That's the news for today, friends.